Colonialism thrives on one principle: divide and conquer. Conquering a united nation is hard, but breaking it apart, that's where the real power lies. After World War I, the French understood this all too well. To satisfy their colonial ambitions, they didn't just invade Syria, they dismantled it from the inside. Fast forward to today, the Syrian conflict is escalating with rebels seizing cities like Aleppo, Hama, and now Homs. But to truly understand this chaos, we need to look deeper. Where did this hatred and division come from? It wasn't natural, it was deliberately engineered, and the roots of this conflict go back nearly a century. Syria once served as a vital hub in the Ottoman Empire, connecting its eastern provinces to the Mediterranean. Major cities like Damascus and Aleppo thrived as crucial trade centers, linking Anatolia, Mesopotamia, and the Arabian Peninsula. Damascus, often called the Pearl of the Arab world, held a long-standing reputation as a center of Islamic learning and culture, while Aleppo was renowned for its bustling commerce in textiles, spices, and other goods. During the early centuries of Ottoman rule, Syria enjoyed relative stability. The empire's governance system allowed for a degree of local autonomy, enabling urban elites, such as merchant families, to prosper under Ottoman patronage. However, as the empire weakened in the 19th century, centralizing reforms sought to reassert Ottoman control over its provinces. These reforms disrupted established local power structures and heightened tensions in the region. World War I brought further hardships. Ottoman military governor Jamal Pasha, infamously nicknamed Jamal the Butcher, executed prominent Arab intellectuals and nationalists in Damascus, and exasperated famine by requisitioning food supplies. These actions further fueled nationalist sentiments across Syria. The promise of Arab independence by the British in exchange for revolt against the Ottomans galvanized Arab nationalist aspirations. Syrian intellectuals and politicians played a pivotal role in shaping the ideology of the Arab Revolt, while Syrian towns and cities provided logistical and political support to the cause. The Arab forces' entry into Damascus in October 1918 marked a critical turning point. It symbolized the collapse of Ottoman authority in the Arab world and the brief realization of Arab nationalist dreams with the establishment of the Arab Kingdom of Syria under King Faisal in 1920. But the moment of triumph was short-lived. Unbeknownst to the Arabs, the British and the French had already conspired to carve up the former Ottoman territories. The secret Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, exposed by the Bolsheviks after the Russian Revolution, had divided the Middle East into spheres of British and French control. Syria, along with Lebanon, fell under the French mandate, effectively dashing hopes of Arab sovereignty. Syrians were united in their sense of betrayal by the Western powers. Nationalist fervor continued to simmer across the region. Recognizing Syria's ethnic and sectarian diversity, the French saw an opportunity to quash resistance to the mandate. To the French, Sunni Arab nationalism represented the greatest threat. But as an ideology, it could not be extinguished through violence alone. So how do you dismantle a nationalist ideology, especially one that has been brewing and evolving for decades? First, the French deliberately fragmented Syria into smaller administrative units, including the state of Damascus, the state of Aleppo, the Alawite state, and the Druze state. Unlike the Ottomans, who had divided Syria for pragmatic administrative purposes, the French divisions were overtly political and exploitative. Aleppo, a Sunni-dominated trade hub, was economically weakened by the exclusion of its Anatolian hinterland, severing vital trade routes and undermining its prosperity. Meanwhile, the creation of Alawite and Druze states isolated these minority groups, deepening divisions. Censorship and surveillance were also integral to the French strategy. Opposition newspapers like Al-Qabbas and Al-Ahrar were shut down, their editors harassed, imprisoned, or exiled. All publications required approval from French authorities, ensuring that anti-colonial narratives were suppressed and pro-French propaganda dominated public discourse. Printing presses were raided and unauthorized materials confiscated. The French established an extensive intelligence network, recruiting local collaborators and informants to monitor nationalist activities. These informants, often drawn from minority groups or local elites, provided intelligence on political gatherings, mosques, and other spaces where nationalist ideas were likely to spread. Local leaders who collaborated with the French against nationalist elites were rewarded with administrative positions and financial incentives. The French further deepened these divides by actively courting minority groups. The Alawites, a Shiite sect marginalized under Ottoman rule, were heavily recruited in the Troupes Spéciales de Levant, the local colonial military force. By granting the Alawites autonomy and portraying themselves as their protectors, the French sowed mistrust between the Alawites and Sunni Arabs. Similarly, Christian communities were favored, with many Christians receiving high-ranking administrative positions and other privileges. French propaganda in pro-colonial newspapers painted Sunnis as destabilizing and oppressive forces, while portraying minorities as civilized allies. This narrative exploited fears of Sunni dominance, particularly following the Arab Revolt, and served to justify French rule as a stabilizing force for minorities. In addition to these societal manipulations, the French used education and cultural influence as tools of control. Missionary schools emphasized Western values and sought to draw Christians away from the Sunni majority. The French seemed to assert that the minorities faced subjugation under the powerful Sunni majority prior to their liberation by France. So was this assertion founded? Under Ottoman rule, Syria's millet system granted significant autonomy to religious minorities such as Christians and Jews, allowing them to manage education, marriage, and religious practices. This fostered a multicultural society where minorities were integrated into urban and economic life, with Sunni Muslims often acting as protectors rather than oppressors. While Ottoman governance had its flaws, systemic repression of minorities was not a hallmark. Moreover, minorities actively participated in the Arab nationalist movement, which sought a unified, independent Arab state. They also thrived economically, especially in trade hubs like Aleppo. Under King Faisal's Arab kingdom, inclusivity was emphasized, with minorities holding key roles in government. This unity sharply contrasted with French colonial strategies, which exploited sectarian divisions to fragment Syrian society and undermine nationalist efforts. France's strategy, however, proved not to be enough to eliminate anti-colonial sentiment. The Druze, while granted certain forms of autonomy under the French mandate, were not consistently favored in the same way as other minorities. Instead, French policies toward the Druze were ambivalent, The Druze were viewed as a fiercely independent and militant community, with a cohesive leadership structure and a geographic stronghold in the rugged terrain of Jabal Druze, making them resistant to typical co-option strategies. The French sought to centralize control and weaken Druze autonomy through measures such as heavy taxation, land expropriation, and the dismissal of local leaders. When these policies met with resistance, the French alternated between offering incentives for collaboration and violent repression. Tensions reached a boiling point when the leaders of Jabal Druze met with the French High Commissioner in Syria to voice their grievances against French General Gabriel Carbile, demanding his removal. Instead of addressing their concerns, the High Commissioner insulted the leaders and threatened harsh consequences. In response, Sultan al-Atrash, a prominent Druze chieftain, declared that revolution was necessary to achieve independence. Thus began the Great Syrian Revolt, a widespread uprising across the state of Syria and Greater Lebanon from 1925 to 1927. Sparked in Jabal Druze and led by Sultan al-Atrash, the revolt quickly grew into a nationalist movement. The rebels' demands included unification of Syria's coastal and inland territories into a single, fully independent Syrian Arab state, the establishment of a Syrian National Congress, the withdrawal of occupying French forces, and the formation of a national army to maintain security. And finally, upholding the principles of the French Revolution: freedom, equality, and fraternity. The revolt quickly spread beyond Druze territories. Marginalized Sunni Arabs were among the first to join. And despite benefiting from French favoritism, many Christians and Alawites also supported the revolt, as they still held Arab nationalist sentiments and opposed the French-imposed divisions. This broad cross-sectarian participation challenged French propaganda, which sought to portray nationalism as a purely Sunni Arab cause. In response, French forces unleashed overwhelming violence. Civilian areas, including Damascus, were bombed twice in 1925 and 1926, resulting in massive loss of life and widespread destruction. Villages suspected of supporting the rebellion were razed, and entire populations were forcibly displaced. Public executions, mass detentions, and collective punishments were used to intimidate both rebels and civilians. To undermine the revolt, the French imposed heavy censorship on nationalist newspapers and disseminated propaganda portraying the uprising as the work of bandits and extremists. By recruiting minorities into colonial military forces and granting them administrative privileges, the French deepened mistrust between communities, undermining nationalist unity. Although French forces ultimately suppressed the uprising by 1927 and exiled leaders like Sultan al-Atrash, the revolt revealed the fragility of French control and the growing strength of Syrian nationalism. The continuation of resistance led to the establishment of a national government of Syria, under which the divided territories were reunited. In addition, parliamentary elections were held as a preliminary step toward the final departure of the French from Syria in 1946. Arab nationalism prevailed in the end, but the French's exploitative policies would leave a lasting stain on Syria. The favoritism shown towards certain minority groups under the French Mandate fueled resentment among the Sunni majority. Grievances over their exclusion from power continued to influence post-independence politics and shaped the trajectory of Syrian governance. The French narrative, which portrayed Sunni dominance as a threat to minority rights, left a lasting imprint on the Alawite community. Over time, these fears contributed to several military coups d'etats by minority factions seeking to secure power. This culminated in the Ba'athist coup of 1963, which brought an Alawite-dominated regime to power. While the new leadership framed itself as revolutionary and inclusive, many Sunnis felt marginalized and claimed to face systemic oppression under Ba'athist rule. French policies also undermined the development of cohesive national institutions, instead favoring localized or sectarian governance structures. This left post-independence Syria with fragile political systems, vulnerable to instability and authoritarianism. The lack of a unified Syrian national identity, exacerbated by the fragmentation fostered during the Mandate, made it difficult for successive governments to create inclusive policies. These divisions persisted, fueling cycles of mistrust and conflict. Sectarian tensions and fragmented governance provided fertile ground for foreign powers to interfere in Syria's internal affairs. In 1957, during the Cold War, the CIA and British intelligence sought to counter Syria's alignment with the Soviet Union and growing pan-Arab nationalism under figures like Jamal Abdel Nasser. They exploited divisions between Sunni elites and minority groups aligned with the Ba'ath Party. Later, during the 1970s and 1980s, the United States indirectly supported Islamist opposition groups such as the Muslim Brotherhood, which represented Sunni interests against the Alawite-dominated regime. Foreign intervention escalated further in the decades that followed. In 1983, a year after Israel's invasion of Beirut, the CIA began plotting to overthrow the Assad regime. This effort intensified under President Obama in 2011, when the CIA, in collaboration with Saudi Arabia, helped engineer an armed insurgency by arming and funding radical Sunni jihadist groups. This sparked the Syrian civil war, which can't even be described as a civil war but a foreign orchestrated attempt to topple the Syrian government. Regional powers such as Israel and Turkey also played roles, supporting Islamist groups opposing Assad through financial aid, medical assistance, and other means. This external meddling, combined with internal divisions, left Syria increasingly fragmented. Cycles of repression, rebellion, and foreign interference have continued to undermine the country's stability, bringing it to the deeply fractured state it faces today. T.E. Lawrence wrote to Western nations following the Arab Revolt, "Do not try to do too much with your own hands. Better the Arabs do it tolerably than you do it perfectly." Since the French Mandate, Syria had been trapped in a cycle of instability. Western intervention in the Middle East has not brought unity or peace, but has instead sown division and chaos. It was never for protecting oppressed minorities under the guise of a benign hegemon as they claim. So can Syria ever achieve lasting peace and stability? Or are the scars of colonial occupation too deep to heal? Recent flare-ups in Aleppo, Hama, and Homs suggest that peace is unlikely in the near future. However, it's not Syria's internal divisions that hinder stability, but the persistent interference by neighboring powers and the West. As long as it continues, conflict will rage on. The rebels currently leading the insurgency do not embody the will of the Syrian people. They are far from the freedom fighters they are sometimes portrayed to be. If Bashar al-Assad were to be overthrown, it would primarily serve the interests of external actors like Israel and Turkey, and would result in the installation of an extremist regime, one that would jeopardize Syria's minority populations and deepen sectarian strife. Such an outcome would not pave the way for peace, only more death and destruction.